All right, let's talk about AP Research. Now, this is a College Board course that's part of the Capstone. Often students may take AP Research after AP Seminar, but it's also a course that is quite a bit different from AP Seminar in some key ways. So today's video is going to be all about what is AP Research about, how do you approach introducing this to students, and then really understanding how to run a successful AP Research course. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's first start with how AP Research is different from AP Seminar. Now, in AP Seminar, I like to explain to students that we are sort of downstream from evidence. We are using evidence to build effective arguments, right? All of the papers are pretty much argument papers. We're using evidence from media sources, academic articles, etc., to build these effective arguments. So we're really downstream from the creation of evidence. So I like to explain that AP Research is different. AP Research, we are upstream to explore methods of creating evidence, right? We are creating data, we are gathering new understandings. And so in this way, we've been downstream so far in most students' academic career, and now we're headed upstream to the creation of evidence and data. So one key thing that is different in AP Research is that we're going to be exploring the academic conversation that previously students would have relied on for evidence, but now we're exploring that conversation not to find evidence as much as to find, okay, where can we add a new understanding to the academic literature and that existing conversation. So this simple chart here, you can see, upstream, AP Research, downstream, AP Seminar. It's also useful to note that this is what students tend to go towards as they head to undergrad and then obviously post-grad. We continually move upstream as we move through sort of the academic pathways. All right, so at its core, the goals of AP Research and what makes an AP Research paper a research paper is that it accomplishes really two things. Number one, it develops a method of gathering new evidence in a reproducible way. Ideally, at the end of this course, their paper should be reproducible enough that someone can read their method, read their paper, and then reenact this research or change variables, but be able to reproduce. The other thing is that it discovers and supports a new understanding. So these papers should be new. Now, one way that they can be new is by changing sort of the participants if they're dealing with a survey, or changing the content if they're doing content analysis. But what we don't want to see from our students in their papers is them regurgitating research that already exists, because then we're not fulfilling the two goals of AP Research, which is reproducible method, and secondly, supporting and discovering a new understanding. All of this can really be explained as big R research. Students may think of research as, scrolling the web, reading JSTOR articles, but research in AP Research, I like to refer to as big R research. It is the research that is about the discovery and development of knowledge, skills, and techniques that are new to the field. This kind of research is really designed to push the boundaries of what's been known or done before, and it innovates rather than imitates. The goal here is to progress culture, provide new insights, and then to open up new opportunities. Like I mentioned earlier, this big R research is also what students experience as they go through our university education system, right? In undergrad, we start with little R research using other people's evidence and data to support ideas. And then by, master's and doctoral programs, we increasingly are just engaged in big R research. So this is one key difference in the research paper versus the sort of papers that students probably have been writing up until this point in their academic career. I always check this with the students when they have a paper. I do a big R check. Does the research provide new understanding? And then does it have a reproducible method? If it has these two things, it can look so many different ways, but it's probably a research paper. All right. Now, what does the paper itself entail? The research paper, it's 4,000 to 5,000 words, topic of the student's choice, And then when that paper is done, they present in what is usually a 15 to 20-minute presentation of the research and findings, usually mirroring the same structure as the paper. Now, some students, they get really excited when they find out they're just focusing on one paper all year long. Other students, they might get excited about that topic and then halfway through the year, they're so tired of it. So it's super important that you, as the AP research teacher, really make sure they pick something that can actually be explored in a year. And more importantly, they're going to be able to hold interest throughout the year. It's also a really great chance for them to really hone in on what they might be interested in a way that other courses don't really allow for. And even for them to feel like, wow, I'm starting to contribute to this academic conversation that I may become a part of when I go to undergrad or further education. So here are some key differences between the actual performance task, between the actual paper. In the blue column, you can see what's indicative of an AP seminar paper, and then in the green column, the AP research paper. Now, a research paper, like many of us may have experienced in undergrad, it usually starts with an introduction and a literature review. So these are multiple paragraphs that really introduce the audience to the topic, but also establish and explore the academic conversation. Very much different than the AP seminar introduction, which just kind of gives context, maybe sets up the argument. And then there's two entirely new sections that they're not going to really be used to doing for AP research. The first of it is the method section. The method section is where they really make sure that it's reproducible, right? They go into detail of how they approached gathering their data and how someone might also be able to reproduce this. And then, of course, once they have done that, the next section would be the results section. And here, students may even represent results with charts and graphs or tables. And this is really where they get to show forth their data and sets up for the rest of the paper. Now, the rest of the paper is discussion, analysis, and conclusion. Now, the discussion, they should have some experience discussing data and evidence from, even AP seminar, but in this case, they're discussing their own evidence and sort of evaluating what are the significance of these results, what are maybe some of the limitations of the data they collected or their method. And then the conclusion, like AP seminar, it often looks forward. In AP research, they are reflecting on sort of their process and maybe even making recommendations for future work to further the academic conversation that they just engaged in. And then, of course, you need a bibliography, but for the research paper, this is going to be considerably longer. All right, so those are the key differences between AP seminar and AP research and how to sort of roll that out to the students. I would say the key thing for you, if you're teaching this course for the first time, is read example papers. There's really no better way to understand this course than to understand the performance task that you're going to be asking students to develop all year long. I remember my first year, I should have read more because there was moments as I went through the process that I really started to understand the performance task, and then I was having students adjust. So please go have the students read it. You should read it. Really familiarize yourself with what the paper is supposed to look like. All right, so let's define some key vocabulary as we get into talking about Unit 1. Unit 1 is all about establishing the academic conversation. It's getting the students into picking a topic and then beginning to explore this academic conversation. So I often start with some vocab so that we have some shared language as we approach this. The academic conversation is really what is happening between scholars. Now, scholars are different from journalists, right? It's different from the sort of sources we see on social media. This is really like what is happening between people in university settings or in some cases NGOs or think tanks. And so this is sort of a conversation that exists around a certain topic or lens. Now, academic literature is the published academic journal articles and academic texts. This is where academic conversation takes place. And it's interesting to sort of let students know that like this is a job, this is what their professors will be doing. Most of their professors probably will be publishing or have published. And so it's sort of a window into the future. So academic conversation, academic literature, really important for them to understand and be able to differentiate between that and other kinds of texts. Now, what they're looking for in Unit 1 is the gap. The gap is really just that. It's a gap in the academic literature. They need to find that and fill it. So they may pick a topic and they maybe have an idea for a paper, and then if it already exists, then they need to find, okay, I'm in the right academic conversation, but what's an actual gap in the understanding that I can contribute to? And so having them pick a gap is essential, and it also takes place in the first part of their paper. Now, how would you use all of these terms in a sentence? Well, you might say something like this. Scholars ensure that their research will arrive at a new understanding by becoming familiar with the academic conversation that is published in the academic literature in order to determine where a gap exists in our current understanding of a given topic. Voila. All right, so how do they identify a gap? Well, you really are starting with the existing knowledge. They have to spend some time reading and understanding what has been said about this topic. And then we are ending up with a deeper knowledge, right? New conclusions, understandings. That's one of the goals of Big R research. So in the middle, in order to close the gap, students employ a method. Students should be reaching a new conclusion in maybe a study or an experiment. Students can apply an existing theory or experiment to a new context. Students may even perform a meta-analysis of existing studies, so they look at it and sort of offer something new in terms of understanding the academic conversation. This one's a little complex. I usually only encourage my real high flyers for that. Number 4, students might create, adapt, or even translate works of art. Specifically, if you have a student who's really interested in maybe a BFA or exploring more of an art path, there's definitely some great examples of that working for AP research. And then lastly, students may apply an action to a new context. These are 5 ways in which they might close the gap. So maybe it would be helpful for us to kind of talk about what that might look like. So there's this great example, which actually I have an example to this in the curriculum that I sell. I use this example with my students, and all these slides that you can see there as well. But there's this article called Virtual Ideas. And in this article, a researcher essentially sees whether students who are playing a video game where they can design their character sort of are influenced by body image and whether that impacts how they play. It's interesting. Students often recognize the game, and so this is one I like to use. But in this research, there's basically an existing conversation that it's entering, which is that popular media has been cited as having negative influence on body image and self-esteem by perpetuating unrealistic ideals. Typically, though, this media has been TV, movies, magazines. And so what Virtual Ideas is doing is they are really asking, okay, how does playing video games that emphasize an unrealistic male body image impact the player's body image? So here they're putting it in a different context, right? They're looking at video games. And throughout this article, they end up closing the gap by taking one of these 5 ways, in this case, a new experiment. They have students sit down and play this game, and then they have a measurement with sort of a post-survey of sort of some of these key body image indicators. That's not super important. What is important here is to see how this process works. Students first understand an existing conversation. They put forth a research question that has already identified a gap, and then they close that gap in their methodology by approaching it in any of these 5 ways. There you go. The deeper knowledge that's achieved is the author actually finds that there was a significant decrease in the body esteem survey after playing like really muscular body ideals in video games. Fascinating. Interesting, similar to the existing knowledge, but different in its context. Okay, so once they've picked a gap, now they can start to think about how their paper should go and what the flow of that will look like. What we're talking about right here is really they're still figuring out their literature review, right? The questions they're asking themselves at the beginning of their paper is, how does my research fit into the context of the academic conversation? And then what is the gap? So they will first explain the academic conversation in a literature review, and then they'll end with a gap. This sets them up to do the next thing. Now, the next thing they have to do is not actually write the method section as much as usually they have to design a research instrument that'll be effective in gathering data. Then in the method section, they will explain how that instrument is designed, how they're going to gather data, their process, as well as defend the choices they make for their method. Then's the fun part, the data collection. This is often my favorite part of the course. Students are analyzing content, they're doing experiments, they're sending out surveys throughout the school or online, and they're really excited to see data start to come in. The results section then takes that data and asks, what does it say? Now, it is not saying what are the conclusions of it. The results section is literally just, here's my findings. No analysis. The next section is where the student starts to give their voice. Now, it's not opinion, right? They're just analyzing data, but this is where you start to see some of their writing skills come out, maybe some of their ideologies. This is an interesting section because they sort of explain the significance, implications, and limitations of their data and conclusions. Lastly, they really, in their conclusion, just offer future direction. They do some summarizing, and they might even relate it back to their literature review between their discussion section and their conclusion section. Then I usually have them prepare the presentation while they do revisions, and after presenting, we focus on just revisions so we have a final draft to submit to College Board. That's the paper. We started by really looking at the setup to it, which is identifying the gap, and in order to do so, they have to dive into the academic literature. All right, so what about the introduction? The introduction I'm going to use to talk about, yes, the opening paragraph, but also the literature review. So here are the 3 jobs of the introduction. Number 1, students should convince the reader that their research project matters. It's relevant, it has implications, it exists out here in a larger context. Then they're going to situate their research within the academic conversation. And then lastly, in their introduction/literature review, they're going to justify that their research question actually addresses the gap that they've already talked about in a sense in their academic literature, which existed in their lit review. These are the 3 jobs of the introduction and literature review. Now, here's how I usually have the students approach outlining this. I think they usually can give enough context to introduce the reader within like 2 to 4 paragraphs. Usually 2, I think, is enough. Then they go into their literature review. I always tell them pick 3 at least studies. 4 would be great. And these are academic sources that they really explain and connect to one another so that we have an understanding of what is happening in the academic conversation. The last part is to draft the gap. And I actually often have them draft the gap before their literature review so that they can really see how the literature review is supposed to set them up for the gap. All right, so here's an example. Let's say you have a student who's a skater and they really want to explore how skateboarding culture and weed use interact. So you might ask, what sort of context does your reader need to know? Well, in the first paragraph, I might have to talk about skateboarding culture. What is the history of skateboarding? How did this exist as the suburbs grew, as sort of counterculture and teen culture grew? And then maybe I also want to do the second paragraph on sort of recreational weed and marijuana and how that grew out of sort of 60s counterculture and 70s counterculture, but then sort of bled into this MTV 1990s skateboarding youth culture more generally. And then I might even explore in the third how that works. All of that is just context. Notice I'm not diving into the academic literature as much as I'm just making sure my reader understands enough to get the academic literature and then, of course, get the rest of the paper. Then I dive into my academic literature. So let's say I found 3 really good sources. One on the subculture of skating, one is a study of male skaters and drug use, and then the last one is maybe an analysis of how marijuana exists in popular skate culture. Now, the gap that the student may find is, hey, these studies talk about skaters, but they don't focus on New York City in particular. Or maybe the study is on male skaters in California, and they're like, yo, we really want to do something on the East Coast. And so the population is the gap. They've found, hey, no one is focusing on New York City, so I want to focus on New York City. And that would be a successful way that a student might approach their introduction, literature review, and gap. All right, there we go. There you can see it all. These are real articles that I found to sort of demonstrate to students that this is how I might approach doing this first part of the paper. You can see there, the first one, there's an actual sort of skate subculture academic research. Another one here, this is a study was done with a survey method that sort of took at how the relationship between unstructured leisure time and substance abuse correlate with male skateboarders. And then what I would have them do before they start writing the actual paper is to start to organize their sources in regards to where they belong thematically in their paper. There's another example. All of these examples, all of these slides, you can find in my materials linked in the bio. Okay. So that is how I would have them approach it. And that's the introduction / literature review. It finds a gap in the knowledge base. It introduces their own question and then how they're going to fill that gap. All right, so let's move on to the second part of the paper, the method section. The method section is the part that really often guarantees that their paper is a big R research paper. It should be reproducible, and this is something new for them. They have not done method sections before, most likely. And according to the rubric, the method section logically defends the alignment of a detailed and replicable research method to the purpose of the inquiry. All right, so there we are again. We've already talked about the literature review. They should have built their research instrument, and this is their method. So I'm going to talk about these 2 items here. All right, so what is the job of the method section? Well, number 1, it gives a clear and precise description of how the method is carried out. Number 2, it offers and defends a rationale for why specific experimental procedures are chosen. And then lastly, it provides information by which the study's validity can be judged. So, description, defends rationale, and then, of course, provides enough information that it can be analyzed and its validity judged. Okay, here's sort of the CFS, which at my school we refer to as criteria for success, is that the method section sets up a study that can actually answer the research question. Do not stop go or pass go. This is something you have to check with your students. Like, they might have a great research question and then they have a method that doesn't actually gather the data to answer it. So make sure once you've seen their research question and once they have an idea of their method that the 2 can actually work together. Also, the method section should generate unbiased results. If they already know that the content they want to analyze produces the results that they think they're going to get, then of course it's going to work like that. The method section has to be unbiased. So if they're selecting content or they're selecting participants for a study, you want a method section that sort of removes the ability for them to self-select or be sort of selective of their data in a way that's just going to confirm their hypothesis. And then importantly, the method section should be so clear that the reader can replicate the experiment in the same or a similar context. Now, College Board doesn't go into a lot of detail on how to write this section, but I usually like to have the students write their method section in 4 parts, and which are usually 4 paragraphs or more, sometimes more. Usually the method section ends up being like 2 to 4 pages. Sometimes you also may want them to include their materials if they're doing like interview or survey questions in an appendix. But here's the 4 parts that I think should be in a method section. Participants, so who is involved in your research, or what is in the case of content analysis. Number 2, materials. What do you use? What is your tools for gathering the data? 3, design. How does it work? How do you implement it? And then 4 is like procedure. This often has like, first I did this, then I did that. These 4 things really help make sure that it's reputable. All right, so there we go. Participants. You might include the number. How did you select them? Was it random? Was it intentional? What is the background on your participants or your content? Number 2, are you using physical materials? Are you using Google Forms? This really explains what you're using. And then design. Is it an experimental design? Is it not? And this is often where the rationale comes in. Why did you design it the way you did? And then lastly, I kind of already talked about this. The procedure is like the schedule. How did you implement this? Okay, so let's practice this. You start obviously with a question and you think about the data. If the question is how old are you, you want to find the age. So then you ask yourself, and the student should ask themselves, what method is best? Well, if I want to know someone's age, I could use a survey. Yep. I could also use an interview. Now, I wouldn't want to use a content analysis, right? And so this is where you want to make sure their method is not mismatched with their question and their data. The instrument is the thing, the tool that helps the researcher execute their method and gather the data they seek. The instrument and the method are different, but the two must exist together. All right, so if I wanted, though, to ask, how do you feel about being 17? An interview is probably better than a survey. Yes, both could give me some feelings about ages based on how I design my survey, but here's where it's important for students to note that there's some methods better for their questions than others. And that's something you should really tease out as you go through the method unit. All right. So let's try a more complex question. Maybe a student has a question that's like, how do Disney TV shows portray the late teen years? Now, you're not probably going to be able to interview a Disney star. You're probably not going to be able to survey a bunch of people. That really will tell you sort of how others feel about Disney's portrayals. In this case, you would want the students to pick a content analysis. And the content that they would be analyzing is sort of plot, dialogue, filming choices. And the instrument would help them methodologize, convert sort of that into quantitative or qualitative data, which can be a difficult process for them, but it's way more difficult if they pick the wrong method. So here's another example of how important it is. Once they have a method selected, then they design their instrument. All right, key point. I've already mentioned it. I'm just driving it home as we wrap up here with the method section. The research instrument is the tool you develop to ensure your data aligns with your research question. Here you can see these are the most common methods. The student, of course, starts with their research question, and then these blue methods are the most common. You've got content analysis, quasi-experimental, survey, interview, correlational analysis, meta-analysis, observational, and then, of course, an actor performance. By and large, I encourage most students to pick survey, interview, content analysis, or correlational analysis, sometimes observational, but these are certainly the easiest to do and to make sure it's reproducible. So, for example, if the research question is, what is the likelihood of the NYPD giving parking tickets on a weekend, you're going to want to do correlational analysis where you look at a data set of parking tickets on any given date, and then you compare that to parking tickets on the weekend, and you make an analysis. Simple example. If I want to understand the complexity of how it is to be in high school and be a migrant, that's probably an interview. If I want to understand the whole school's opinion on what's their favorite food, that's like a survey. And so in that sense, the research instrument is really better equipped for certain ones, but students should know their choices. They probably don't know what these mean, so that you need to explain their menu to them before they pick one so that they pick the right one for their data. All right, that's the method section. We're going to wrap up and look ahead at what comes next. Once they have their instrument, they should collect their data, and then they will be ready for their results section. Now, using the data to answer the question, you need to understand the variables of the research question as well. So I'm going to show you what I usually roll out with students. Again, if you want to see these materials, they're linked in the bio. But I had a student who asked this question. They asked, how does being surrounded by other children of immigrants impact children of immigrants' cultural identity and feelings about their culture? What are the variables of her research question? Variables, things that you are measuring, right? You can see them: cultural identity and feelings about their culture. Those are the variables. This question will only gather data about their cultural identity and their feelings about their culture. In red, underlined, this is really the part of the research question where you're explaining the context or situation being studied. Surrounded by other children of immigrants, how does that impact our participants, the children of immigrants, cultural identity, and feelings about their culture? All right, so that's step one. Once you have your variables, then you can move on to the next step. Step two, let's say you have the data. Here you can see the data is already gathered, and here is like what literally this student's work looked like in regards to their results section. So here in the results section, you'll see the first thing that they do is talk about the data. So in this case, the student did a research survey, and they're explaining how many of the participants, they got 36 students to take their survey, how many were 9th graders, 10th graders, 12th graders, etc. And then they also explain from their respondents how many of them are immigrants and from what different cultural backgrounds do they represent. And then you'll notice that they're talking about tables. So in their results section, they're also going to have tables. And this is basically just where they explain the data. They're not doing analysis, they're just explaining. So for example, here you can see the data from the first statement, table 1, shows that 91.6% of respondents have met other students who share the same culture as them. Okay, just talking about trends. All right, so this is some of the ways that they might end up representing. And if they're using Google Forms, often these charts are already made for them automatically in the Google form. So here was one of the survey questions. It was agree or disagree, and it was, I feel comfortable talking about my culture with others in school. There you can see the majority agreed or strongly agreed. There's another example. Another example. This is our data, and it's starting to answer our research question. So you may ask, what part of the research question is this portion of text connected to? This is something I have the students practice, and you can sort of say, okay, this one has to do with our variable of cultural identity. This one has to do with our variable of feelings about their culture. And in this sense, we know how to discuss and present our sort of data. We can match the trends with the variables of the RQ. That's step 2. Step 3 would be to visualize this, as I've shown. Visualization is extremely helpful, kind of regardless of the method. And then lastly, students should use qualitative data to explain quantitative trends. Here's what I mean by this. If they have sort of a interesting piece of percentage or number data, and they also have an open-ended question that helps students expound on that, they can often use that qualitative data to explain the quantitative trend. All right, so that is the results section. It's what does my data say? What is my findings? As simple as that. The next section is the discussion section. Now, there are 5 essential questions that students should answer for this section, and I think that if students answer these 5 questions, they're probably going to have a strong discussion section. So number 1, what is the answer to my research question? Notice they have not answered their research question yet in the paper. They have talked about data and trends, but here is where they're answering the question. Of course, in this discussion, they are talking about what data led them to this answer. And then here's where they loop it back to where it began. The third essential question is, how does this answer fit within the academic conversation? And then fourth, how does it fill a gap in the academic conversation? Lastly, the discussion and analysis is often where they should talk about the limitations. All the students will have a limitation. Does not mean the paper is weak. There are limitations all over the place. If it's content, I wish I could have seen more content. If it's survey, I wish I would have had more people, or even errors that they made. I noticed I left out a question that I should have had. I wasn't able to do this, etc. Nothing wrong with limitations, but if they don't acknowledge the limitations, they're not going to get full points on the rubric. Now, what is the difference between the results and the discussion section? Let's be super clear. The results section presents the data and the findings of the study. It uses figures, tables, and statistics to show what was discovered. It does not interpret or explain the data. It focuses on objective outcomes. All right, so here's the discussion section. It interprets and explains the meaning of the results. It discusses how the findings relate to the existing literature, and it highlights the significance, potential impacts, while also addressing limitations and maybe even starting to suggest directions for future research. Notice nowhere in here are students making a should argument. They're simply now providing their analysis based on the data. And that sets them up for the last bit of the paper. The last part is the conclusion. The main goal here is reflecting on future work. There are 4 essential questions. What impact would this research have on the wider world? What impact would this research have within my field of study? What are possible next steps? And then also, how can future researchers address the limitations of the study? All of it is sort of looking out at a bigger world or out towards the future. That's the conclusion, and that's really what a strong academic paper should end on. Okay, discussion versus conclusion. We've already talked about this, but in the conclusion, you should not be introducing any new data or argument. The conclusion is usually the shortest and the most general. It talks about sort of what is the big important insights of the research versus the data in general. This is the wrap up of your research and gives the reader a final impression. Make sure that the research question is answered between the discussion and the conclusion. And then lastly, I often tell students, if you've already presented the results, you don't have to repeat them there. But if you're synthesizing them into a final takeaway, that's effective. All right. So that brings us to the very last portion of the course, and that is the presentation. I usually tell the students that, the presentation, it's 15 to 20 minutes, but you can really do it in 10 slides, especially if you can expound on it. Now, most students do more than 10 slides, but at its core, the presentation has these parts: context, overview of research question, the literature review, the gap, the method, the results, the discussion, the limitations, future research. This is the paper in presentation format. No need to post paragraphs on here. We're distilling it. We're putting it in bullet point form. We're making it visually appealing. This is your TED Talk. This is where you really get to show your research in a presentation in a digestible format. And this is really really great moment in the course because I love getting to see what they've worked on all year live. And the panel often just like really appreciates the students who go above and beyond on their presentation. Probably more than 10 slides, but I show this to students to say you probably could do it in 10 slides. All right, there's the rubric. They mostly get assessed on the content of the presentation. There is some assessment in regards to their performance. So their vocal delivery, how effective they are as a performer. So it's not just what they present, but it's how they present. But of course, what they present is worth more. Okay, there's a checklist for the presentation. Topic, argument, tone feels appropriate. At least 3 researchers identified by full name, right? Like the literature review, like tell us where in the world your research fits in. The research is intentional. There's a gap, how the question was investigated, and then of course going into some of the details like they do in the method section, why they chose the method section, some limitations, and then of course how it contributes, how it impacts the broader world. That's an effective presentation. That was a long video, but hopefully that was enough to get you starting to think about how you want to approach this course. Again, my number one recommendation is read example papers. Read examples of what got 4s and 5s and what got 3s, 2s, and 1s so you can understand what makes an effective paper and how you can better support your students in being effective. Now, if you want a year-long curriculum, I have worked on this course for many years, and I have put that all together in a nice package that has hundreds of slides, all the handouts, everything you've seen today, and so much more that's separated by by units. So please do check that out, and don't forget to like and subscribe.